This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for this episode of When Science Speaks. This episode is sponsored by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build strategic relationships with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional lives. And that journey often involves effective translation of complicated research into engaging, jargon-free communication that captures the attention of general audiences. If you're interested in getting a free resource to help you do just that, go to complexitymadeclear.com and get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's complexitymadeclear.com to get your very own free infographic used by science communicators at various organizations to boil down, but not dumb down, complicated science and technical topics for general audiences. It is a great pleasure to have Rebecca Zucker on the show today. Rebecca is an expert in executive coaching and career development. She coaches C-suite executives and other senior leaders across the globe. In addition to several venture-backed startups, Rebecca's clients have included Amazon, Clorox, Dropbox, Genentech, Google, and Stanford's Distinguished Careers Institute, among many other organizations. Rebecca is a regular contributor to Harvard Business Review and Forbes.com. She graduated as valedictorian from Stern School of Business at NYU and received her MBA from Stanford. She also earned her coaching certification from the CTI and from Minds at Work. Welcome to the show, Rebecca. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
You know, many listeners make major transitions throughout their professional life, whether it's from grad student to PhD, postdoc perhaps, maybe into the professoriate, all sort of while wondering if they want to make academia their professional home. And often there's an internal or external expectation during the journey that they will, should they continue or not on the academic track, for example. And it can be hard to reverse course and make changes once they've sort of committed to a particular career path. And your own career path reflects some of these elements. And I would love for you to share with us the pathway that you are pursuing at the outset of your career journey and how you pivoted towards your true passion.
Yes. So after business school, I went into investment banking and worked at Goldman Sachs in New York. And I ended up leaving to fulfill a lifelong dream of living and working in Paris. And we have that in common.
We do, yes.
And that was a fantastic experience. I worked for Disney Consumer Products doing strategic planning for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And while it was a really great global experience, it was also extremely demanding. It was pretty much investment banking hours. Mm-hmm. And I was a bit burnt out, and I left my job, but I stayed in Paris and took a year off. So that was the quickest year of my life, I like to say. And during that time, it was not a career move, but just to subsidize my living expenses, I taught English. I help people doing interview prep for banking interviews in London. I help people with their business school applications and did some presentation skills coaching at companies like Apple in Paris. And what I learned from this was that I love supporting other people to succeed. That was my real big takeaway. And I also learned, although I wasn't conscious of it till many years later, that, hey, I can support myself doing this. And when I came back to the States, I ended up going back to banking, but pivoting towards a learning and development role. And I ran learning and development for the investment banking division of a regional tech-focused investment bank in San Francisco, where I'm based. And that was a terrific job because I was always drawn to the people side of business. And so I love business and I love people. And the intersection of those two things is really where my passion lies. Mm-hmm. And that was a terrific job. And that ended. I was in the second wave of several waves of layoffs, as training and development or learning and development typically is in an early wave. And I knew during that time I had started to work with a coach. I had been intrigued about this nascent field of coaching. This was 20-ish years ago. And started taking some classes. And I knew that this was the work that I wanted to do. And very early on, joined up with my co-founder. And it'll be 20 years in January that I co-founded my firm, Next Step Partners. So it was very much an evolution, but the clues were there all along the way. And it's really sort of paying attention to that common thread throughout all of your roles. What is it that really excites you the most? And for me, it was always the people side of the job. I was always front and center when it came time to coach, mentor, recruit, anything that had to do with people. I was incredibly energized and excited to do.
I love that. I love that story. And it's funny, as an aside, I remember when what was then called Euro Disney was opening in the Paris area. And it was sort of like, there was all these mixed emotions because it was this big American icon, and the French sometimes, kind of sniff and down their nose at things like that. And then while I was still there, it was rebranded Disneyland Paris.
Yes.
And like all of a sudden it was like, this is a cool place. We got to check this place out. It's not that far. It had Paris in the name, obviously, but not inside Paris. But anyway, that's my French Disney recollection story.
Well, if it tells you how much I was working there, I had what was called a silver pass, which was good for me and 3 guests to go 26 times a year. That's every other weekend. And I never went. That's how much I was working. And I did not want to spend time with Mickey on my time off. Exactly.
You're spending enough time with Mickey and friends during all those hours you're putting in at the office. Great. And, you talked about this kind of realization and following your true passion. And first of all, congratulations on this upcoming 20th anniversary. That's a big deal for Next Step Partners. And I know listeners would love to hear more about your firm, its mission, your focus, and so forth.
Sure. Well, we are all about developing leaders who create positive change in the world, and really creating long-term partnerships with the leaders and their organizations. Many of our clients we've worked with for over a decade. Our longest term client is 19 years, who we've been with. And, we see ourselves as partners, not as vendors. And in working with these leaders, we do one-on-one executive coaching. We do team development, as well as group leadership development programs and career transition. And funnily, our roots are in career transition because we started right after 9/11 and there were no leadership budgets. Mm-hmm. Everyone, was sadly with the state of the economy after, those horrible events that, people were in a position to look for something new. So really supporting people throughout their careers is what we look to do, supporting them and their organizations.
Mm-hmm. And as part of that career trajectory, various moments, various episodes during a career, it's totally normal to feel overwhelmed, at various times. And that is one of your areas of expertise, among others, is how to cope with being overwhelmed. Many listeners in the academic environment, for example, all these different responsibilities, short time frames, and so forth. And, this dynamic is so familiar to many listeners. I know it would be helpful for you to share some of your expertise regarding how to deal with overwhelm. What are some of the signals that we might be feeling overwhelmed, and the results, in terms of cognitive and physical effects that you talk about? And one other thing is, when did overwhelm become a noun?
Yes.
We were overwhelmed, but it's like so prevalent. It's like now it's a thing. It's actually a noun, overwhelm.
Yes. Well, I think starting with that question, it started with this little thing called the internet, which effectively quadrupled the amount of information coming at managers every day. Mm. And clearly, with the advent of the iPhone and now other messaging applications like Slack, et cetera, which I very much am a user of, these are great technologies, but it has created, it's sort of a good news, bad news. Good news is you can work anywhere, anytime. Bad news, you can work anywhere, anytime, and has created an always on culture. And I think it is very much an American culture, but we do see this globally as well. But I would say it's particularly acute in America. But some of the signs of overwhelm, they're not always visible. They're not always visible. Somebody can be flustered or impatient or forgetful. Cognitively, it can result in brain fog or racing thoughts, exhaustion, outright panic. It can also show up at work through missed deadlines or lack of focus, or they might start blaming other people or become defensive or irritable. It's going to be different for each person. And so as a manager, it's also being able to recognize this, not only in yourself, but for other people around you who you might be in a position to help. But I wrote an article about 2 years ago, almost exactly. It was 2 years ago in October, called How to Deal with Constantly Feeling Overwhelmed in Harvard Business Review. And I outline a number of strategies, but there are many more than what I was able to articulate in that article. And I think of them in two categories. I think of them as preventative strategies. So how do you stop the overwhelm from happening in the first place? And then there's the in the moment strategies of what happens when you do find yourself starting to get overwhelmed, when you do sort of pick up on those signs and symptoms. So just to share a couple of preventative strategies. One is to just be really clear about your boundaries, and not only set the boundaries, but keep the boundaries. And that is the hard part for a lot of my clients. They set the boundaries, they block out time for themselves or thinking time or time to actually get work done, but then they let it get scheduled over with other things. So really being firm about keeping those boundaries. And we can get into a little bit if you like, about what keeps them from keeping those boundaries, but also setting expectations from the get-go about what can and can't be accomplished. What are the trade-offs that might need to be made? Okay, if this other project is now a priority, what is being deprioritized? Also challenging our own perfectionism. We can be our own worst enemy here.
Right.
Our packed calendars are, as our mutual friend Dory Clark says, is a prison of our own making oftentimes. But also finding out what you can outsource or delegate personally and professionally, whether it's having somebody clean your home or do your cooking, and at work, what are the tasks that are low value, are not the highest and best use of your time, and could be a learning experience for somebody else on your team that would really help them develop and step up and take more off your plate even.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'm just thinking about the lab environment sometimes and folks with different levels of experience and maybe saying, look, can we delegate this to someone who's newer in the lab or earlier on in their studies? Sometimes the challenge can be the power dynamic.
Yes.
If the boss says this has to get done, how do I very nicely suggest that maybe that timeline is a bit aggressive?
Yes. And that's a really interesting point you bring up, because so often, one of the preventative strategies is challenging our limiting beliefs and assumptions. And there are many places where we can do that. And this is one of them. Our belief around, what my boss asks for is really a mandate, and I can't have a reasonable two-way conversation about what can effectively be done in a certain period of time or with a certain budget and so on. And so we do have these beliefs and assumptions, which aren't always accurate. And I'm actually conducting some additional research, or some deeper research, I should say, around the inner drivers of overwhelm. Because when you think about it, overwhelm is inherently an inner experience. And the tidal wave of stuff coming at us is not likely to lessen anytime soon. That's not to say we shouldn't have these conversations to, push back when things are unreasonable. But the workload, is not likely to decline. And I would say both the pace and volume of the work. And so what is it within ourselves that has, person A become overwhelmed, but maybe not person B? And so that's what I'm trying to unpack in some additional research that I'm doing to get at what those inner drivers of overwhelm are. And perceptions of power is one of those.
Fascinating. That's going to be so helpful to so many people, and look forward to seeing that when you've completed that deeper research that you mentioned. Imposter syndrome. This is a big deal for so many of us. And, it stalks many high performers. You talked about perfectionism. That's something that we all need to be on the lookout for. People feeling at various times that they're not as intelligent as peers or talented, and they shouldn't, they don't deserve to be in their current role. All these sorts of very, very negative reflex reactions that people have. Do you see any similarities between the overwhelm that we've been talking about and imposter syndrome? And perhaps maybe there are ways that some of the strategies for combating overwhelm can be applied to people who are suffering from imposter syndrome.
Yes. And imposter syndrome is one of the dimensions I'm looking at as well. And I can share a link to my survey in case anyone would like to take it.
That would be wonderful. Really, really helpful. We'll do that.
Terrific. I think there is, there's a Venn diagram, and people who suffer from imposter syndrome are likely, I think, to feel overwhelmed, because imposter syndrome is inherently feeling like you're in over your head, that you are not qualified to do what you are expected to do. Even if you are, it's the feeling that you're not. And sure, that can absolutely lead to feelings of overwhelm. And, there are various strategies that one can use to sort of combat that imposter syndrome and challenge those limiting beliefs and assumptions about your own capabilities. But for sure, that can lead to feelings of overwhelm.
Great. And we'll make sure to get that link out to folks who would be interested in filling out this survey that I know is going to produce important results. Rebecca, as we wrap up the interview and we think about the pandemic, which is still going on while we are having this conversation, and think forward to next year, it's been overwhelming for so many of us just to be in this very different period in our lives that wasn't expected. Any anti-overwhelm strategies, if you will, that maybe we should know about, given the new workplace norms, for example, that are being cobbled together right now to deal with COVID, for example?
Right. Well, I think that, we're not entirely through the pandemic. There's some light at the end of the tunnel, but there's a lot of uncertainty still, and uncertainty and how we deal with that can be a source of overwhelm, as can, each person's personal situation, home and work situation can vary to the extent that they need to worry about unvaccinated kids. This is all about overwhelm. I think about it in terms of having limited cognitive capacity, and all of the worries that we have, whether it's about not having the right work environment at home, or worrying about going back to the office and being exposed to COVID from a colleague potentially, or worrying about your kids, whatever those things are. This is like a program operating in the background on our hard drive, taking up space on the hard drive, which leaves less space for other things, for the thinking and the work that we need to focus on doing. And so having less capacity, we're more likely to get overwhelmed. So I would say really taking care of your needs, whatever those might be, and not waiting until you reach that breaking point, but being very conscious of it all along the way and do what you need to do to manage that effectively. And it's going to be different for everybody.
Rebecca Zucker, thank you so much for those insights and really helpful, specific, actionable items that people can take and actually start to put into practice right away.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Sure. And listeners, thank you for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.